Everybody. We already have over 20 attendees, and I think they are gonna grow. So welcome everybody, benvenuti a tutti, buon 24 maggio. I am Chiara Durazzini. I am a member of the Cultural Committee of the Dante Alighieri Society of Massachusetts. Today is May 24th, and so that's why today we are celebrating the birthday of the sommo poeta Dante Alighieri, even though we don't actually really know his date of birth, but historians, and Professor Pertile can add something about this, historians think it was in the second half of May, maybe the beginning of June, but we don't know. So today we are celebrating, even with a beautiful day here in Boston. We are delighted and honored to have the Professor Lino Pertile. Lino Pertile is a Carl Pescosolido researcher, professor of Romance languages and literature at Harvard University, and he's also the member of the Accademia dei Lincei in Roma. He is the author of many books, and I send you to read his bio if you haven't yet. But his latest book is still in press, right, Professor? And the title is Dante Popolare. Sounds very interesting.
Oh no, that is being in press means that it is being printed now. Exactly.
So let us know when he comes out, and I don't know what's about.
We are, you know, this kind of planning that was pretty standard until 2-3 months ago has now become incredibly difficult, and so we don't know. You know, the editorial industry is at a standstill.
Is it blocked, bloccata? Is it
yes, it also,
frozen?
No, there is a standstill, and so I'm not sure when it is going to be coming out. Probably in the autumn rather than now.
But please let us know, send us an email, because we are curious to see what's about, Dante Popolare.
Okay.
Okay, so my friends, welcome again. We are here for this wonderful lecture, Exile and Creativity, Dante in 1320. And here is Professore Lino Pertile directly from Florence. And here we go.
Good morning to all of you, and I'm delighted to be in your midst, even if only virtually. I've been at the Dante Alighieri many times in the early the 21st century. That is about 15 years ago. I used to come quite often at the Dante. And I'm very happy to be back there today and to celebrate, or at least to remember, Dante's birthday. As Chiara was mentioning, we don't actually know exactly when he was born. We know that his birthday occurred at the end of the month of May, perhaps beginning of June. Certainly under the astrological sign of Gemini, and Dante actually said so in one of, in fact, in Canto 22 of Paradiso. Now, one thing that I should say, in fact, regarding dates and facts surrounding Dante's life is that we don't have many documents. We have, in fact, very little documentation telling us about the details of Dante's life. He himself didn't leave anything written by his own hand, not even a signature. We haven't got anything. We have masses of writing by Petrarch and Boccaccio, who were only a few years younger than him. But by Dante, we don't have anything at all. And this makes it particularly difficult and therefore tempting for historians to elaborate the few details that one can manage to glean from Dante's own writing. So, yes, we have Dante's writings because these have been handed down from generation to generation through other copies, but he did not leave us an autographic copy of the Divine Comedy. No, we don't have that. We don't have anything of that kind. So we have to imagine, which is not too bad. And then the imagination is cannot be very far from reality. But what was Dante doing on the 24 maggio del 1320? We don't know exactly, but we are almost certain that he was in Ravenna. He was in Ravenna, where he had come perhaps 1 or 2 years before that, perhaps in 1318, 1319, from Verona, where he had spent a number of years. In Ravenna, he was a guest of Guido Novello da Polenta, who was a nobleman. He was also the podestà, the mayor, but in fact, it's the signore, really, the lord of Ravenna at the time, and was also a bit of a poet himself. Certainly was a very erudite fellow who was proud of being the host of Dante Alighieri. Why so? Because Dante by then was already known as a great poet. Because though the Divine Comedy was not complete yet, was not finished, Dante had already released at least the first 2 canticles. The Inferno and the Purgatorio were out there. So there were 67 cantos, at least 67 cantos of the comedy were there for people to read and to talk about. And especially the Inferno, of course, was the kind of book that lent itself to an extraordinary amount of gossip and stories, as you can imagine, because it told the fate, the destiny of so many Italians, so many Tuscans, so many Romagnols, and where they were now in the other world, where they were now forever, whether they were in Inferno, where they were in Purgatory. Paradiso, Dante hadn't yet finished it, and so I'm going to talk about it in a minute. But so we are sure that he was in Ravenna, and that he probably was writing the Paradiso, having completed Inferno and Purgatorio, and having released the first 2 canticles. He was, as I said, a guest of Guido Novello da Polenta, who was, in fact, he was the nephew of Francesca da Rimini. Those of you who are familiar with the Inferno will certainly remember the beautiful episode of Francesca da Rimini in Canto 5 of Inferno, Amor canullo amata, mar perdona, one of the most famous episodes of Dante's Inferno. And, well, she was related to Guido Novello da Polenta, who was in fact her nephew. So it's a strange thing, really, because Dante met people whose relatives he had found, as it were, in hell or in purgatory or in some part of the other worlds which he had visited in the year 1300. I will come to that in one moment. But what was Dante? Who else was around Dante in 1320 in Ravenna? Well, almost certainly he had 2 sons and a daughter with him. The sons were called Pietro and Giovanni. Sorry, Pietro and Jacopo. And the daughter was called Antonia. Antonia eventually became a nun in the convent of Santo Stefano in Ravenna. And there, in fact, she actually died in 1371, became a nun, and as far as we know, she took the name of Beatrice as a nun. She took the name of Beatrice as a nun. It was a family name, obviously. And there is also a chance that a third boy was with Dante at that time, Giovanni. Giovanni appears as a son of Dante Alighieri, but only twice. And the problem with him is that he has no documentary evidence of his own, no documentary evidence at all. And therefore, many historians doubt that he ever existed, and they think that it might be somebody else, like somebody from Padua, or Giovanni. But the chances are that Dante had three boys and a girl, so Giovanni, Pietro, and Jacopo, and a daughter called Antonia, who became Sor Beatrice. What about his wife, Gemma Donati? It's another mystery. We don't know. Was she there with him, or was she in Florence? We don't know. It is as simple as that. And we are free to imagine, as we wish, to write that story. It's complicated and puzzling, but we can't really say more than that we don't know. It is possible that she was there with him and the children. How old were the children? We don't know. But we assume that they were at least in their early 20s, because the law was that when a person was exiled, was banished by Florence, his children had to follow him once they were 14. So we assume that his children were at least 15 in 13, 15, and I come to that at that point. And so we assume that they were born in the 90s, in the 1290s, if not even before. But that's again, we have no idea of when they were born. Dante doesn't mention never mention his children or his wife in any of his works. Had he done so, it would have been exceptional, because writers started talking about their families much, much later. It wasn't at all common for a writer to speak about his or their own private affairs, or their own domestic affairs. So Dante was not an exception on this account. What was he doing at the court, in the house of Guido Novello da Polenta? He was probably doing some work for him as an ambassador, as we will see in a minute. But his main occupation was the completion of the third canticle of his comedy, which, as you know, became known as the Divine Comedy only in the 16th century, after a Venetian edition of the poem that was called the Divina Commedia, that was printed in 1555. And after that, the Commedia became known as the Divina Commedia, though Boccaccio himself called it Divine or Divina Commedia. But the title was given and became the standard as Divina Commedia only in the 16th century. Dante was, said, finishing the Paradiso. I was actually, my idea is that he might actually have been writing Canto 25th of Paradiso, which begins in a way that is very, very evocative, and in many ways sad, and at the same time, however, very exciting, typically Dantesque way of beginning of a canto. If we could have the text, Chiara, perhaps we could, our listeners could look at the text. But I'm going to read it for you, and here it goes. This is how Canto, excellent. So this is how it begins. Se mai continga che il poema sacro al quale ha posto mano e cielo e terra, sì che m'ha fatto per molti anni macro, vinca la crudeltà che fuor mi serra del bello vile ov'io dormì agnello, nemico ai lupi che gli danno guerra. Con altra voce omai, con altro vello ritornerò poeta, e in sul fonte del mio battesimo prenderò il cappello, però che nella fede che fa conte l'anima è Dio, quivi intra io, e poi Pietro per lei si mi girò la fronte. Well, let's look at the translation by Derling and Martinez. If it ever happened that this sacred poem, to which both heaven and earth have set their hand, so that for many years it has made me lean, vanquish the cruelty that locks me out of the lovely sheepfold where I slept as a lamb, an enemy of the wolves that make war on it. With other voice by then, with other fleece, I shall return as poet, and at the font of my baptism I shall accept the wreath. For there I enter the faith that makes souls known to God, and later Peter, Saint Peter that is, so circled my brow because of it, that is because of my faith. It's an extremely interesting and in many ways puzzling beginning of a canto. And I like to think that he was writing this more or less on his 55th birthday, because this is what it is that we are celebrating today. Dante was born in 1365, and so, in 1265 in Florence, and therefore in 1320 he was just 55 years old. 55 years old. He was in exile, as we understand immediately from the second the second terzina of this text that we've got here before our eyes. So if it ever comes to happen that the sacred poem, Dante calls his poem a sacred poem. Why does he call it a sacred poem? He calls him so because he is convinced that he's not just himself the author of that poem. He thinks that that poem is the work of his hand, but it is really inspired by God himself. It's really a poem to which both heaven and earth have contributed. And therefore, it is a sacred poem. As sacred as the books of the Bible, as the books of the New Testament. This is Dante's attitude towards his own books, towards these three books, certainly of his, the three books that make up the comedy. Now, if it should happen that the sacred poem should vanquish the cruelty that locks me out. Now, here is really talking about his exile. It locks me out of what? Of the beautiful sheepfold. This is Florence. Florence has a beautiful sheepfold, which is besieged, however, by what? By many, many wolves. And he is the enemy of the wolves. And we understand, therefore, that Dante, at the moment, is or compares himself to a lamb who is threatened, constantly threatened by the wolves. A lamb who is trying to win a battle against the wolves. And Dante has this vision of Florence as a battlefield, Florence as a place that is constantly besieged and troubled really by conflicts of all sorts of civil conflicts between various parties that want to reach or to gain supremacy over the others in the city. Conflict between church and empire, conflicts between Guelphs and Ghibellines, and within the Guelph party, conflicts between black Guelphs and white Guelphs. So conflicts between families, conflict between parties, conflicts between between different clans. It's a very intricate picture that is extremely difficult to paint and to understand, because the terms in which the conflict take place are not really similar, nowhere as similar to the way in which we normally look at the civil conflicts today. So he said, if the sacred poem, al quale ha posto mano e cielo e terra, sì che m'ha fatto per molti anni macro. Molti anni. How many years? How many years had Dante been working at this sacred poem? Again, we don't know exactly, but we have a good idea that Dante had started writing the Inferno probably around 1307. 1306, 1307. So therefore, in 1320, he had been working at it at least for 13, 14 years. I would say at least, I'm personally convinced that he had been working at it for much more than that, because before he started writing, Dante had been thinking about it very, very in great detail. But he had been working on it at least for 15 years. And it is as a result of all this work that he had become magro, as they would say now in Italian, lean. It's a man that you've seen many pictures of Dante, and he certainly looks a very lean poet. Lean, why? Partly because Dante's life, the last 19 years of his life, 20 years of his life, were not easy. Dante had been banished from Florence in between 1301 and 1302. The final sentence of banishment came in January 1302, but he was already out, and he never got back home. And you might say that Ravenna is not such a bad exile is not so far from Florence, and it is true, it's not far from Florence. Nowadays, you can travel from Florence to Ravenna, I suppose, in 2 or 3 hours by car or by train. But for Dante, it was an immense distance. It is on the other side of Apennine, and it is a different world. It's a different world. Dante is at the same time passionately in love with Florence, and also passionately hates Florence for all the things that Florence does that he disagrees with, that he finds absolutely abominable. So I should perhaps mention a few things about Florence. Florence was an incredibly dynamic place in 1300. When Dante became emperor, Dante achieved, in 5 years, achieved the highest position in the government of the city, the position of priore. In June and July 1300, Dante was priore, and that was the beginning of his misfortune, unfortunately, but that is what happened to him. And that it was because of politics that he was exiled from Florence. But at the time, Florence was an incredibly dynamic and vibrant city. I mean, I can simply mention in terms of in physical terms, we have to think that such churches as Santa Maria Novella, Santa Croce, or even Santa Maria del Fiore, or even the Palazzo Vecchio, all these buildings that are now, that define Florence, with which Florence is now identified forever, were being built then as Dante lived in Florence in the first 20 years, or in between 1280 and I can't say between 1280 and 1300, because some of those buildings took much longer to be built. But Florence was a huge building site when Dante was there in the 1290s. And this progress, these changes, this dynamism that brought in so many people from the countryside, that made this dynamism that made Florence into one of the most prosperous and promising cities in Italy, indeed in Europe, a great financial center of Europe. Well, Dante hated all this. Dante was very much against all this. He thought that this did not bring any peace, any happiness to anybody, and that people would only become more and more attached to money, more and more anxious to make money, to possess more things, more estate and so on, and therefore would move further and further away from true happiness. And so, partly, this is one of the reasons why Dante writes the Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy is written precisely to stop this, to change all this, in which, of course, the church was involved very deep. But I really can't say too much about that. What I'm keen to say is that since Dante was exiled, was banished, and was kept out of Florence until he died, basically because he profoundly disagreed with the way things were done in Florence, with the direction of Florentine politics and Florentine economy and society. He was totally opposed to it. One of the first records of Dante's exile can be found in a work that Dante never completed, the Convivio. It's a beautiful work of prose and poetry. And I want to read it to you. We can look at it as the text and number 2 from the Convivio, because it gives you an example of what Dante felt about his exile earlier on. This probably around 1305. And here it is. So it says, but it's the one above, I think it is. So it is the one below, sorry, the one below. There it is, that's it, that's from the Convivio. This is what Dante writes. Poi che fu piacere dei cittadini della bellissima e famosissima figlia di Roma, Fiorenza, di gettarmi fuori del suo dolce seno, nel quale nato e nutrito fui infino al colmo della vita mia, e nel quale con buona pace di quella desidero con tutto lo cuore di riposare l'animo stancato e terminare lo tempo che mi è dato, per le parti quasi tutte alle quali questa lingua si stende, peregrino, quasi mendicando, sono andato, mostrando contra mia voglia la piaga della fortuna, che suole ingiustamente al piagato molte volte essere imputata. Veramente io sono stato legno senza vela e senza governo, portato a diversi porti e foci e liti dal vento secco che vapora la dolorosa povertà. So, you see, exile, poverty, desperate need of tangible support. From whom? From various people, various signori around, first around Tuscany, then Verona, then Ravenna, partly also other smaller cities in northern Italy. That is where really Dante spent the rest of his life for 20 years, roaming from one place to the next, without a home, without a home. This is a translation by Richard Lansing. Since it was the pleasure of the citizens of the most beautiful and famous daughter of Rome, Florence, to cast me out of her sweet bosom, where I was born and bred up to the pinnacle of my life, and where with her good will I desire with all my heart to rest my weary mind and to complete the span of time that is given to me. I have traveled like a stranger, almost like a beggar, virtually all the regions to which this tongue of our extends, that is the Tuscan, displaying against my will the wound of fortune, for which the wounded one is often unjustly accustomed to be held accountable. Truly, I have been a ship without sail or rudder, brought to different ports, inlets, and shores by the dry wind that painful poverty blows. This is an early statement that he makes, as I said, 1305, and Dante probably never thought that he would have been kept out of his home for the rest of his life. He never thought that would happen. But it did happen, partly because he was so uncompromising. Dante did not bend, did not come to any condition that Florence might have put. When people were exiled in the 1300s from Italian cities, and it happened very often, they weren't exiled on their own. It didn't happen to an individual. It happened to a large number of individuals who belong to a certain political, how can you call it? It's not really party, but association. Dante belonged to the white wealths, and he was compromised with the white wealths, in fact, as a prior of the white wealth government. And he was exiled, banished. Had he wanted to, he could have paid a fine and defended himself, but he refused to do that because Dante was extremely proud. And so he refused to do that, and the Comune of Florence gave him this, recompensed him by sentencing him to death, a sentence that was confirmed later, as late, in fact, as November 1315. Dante was sentenced to beheading by his beloved city of Florence. And with him, his children were sentenced to death too. This is in 1315. But he would not bend. In 1315, Dante was given a chance to go back. But in order to take advantage of an amnesty that Florence had promulgated, he had to do two things. First, he had to pay a fine, a heavy fine, in money. And second, he had to do something that Dante would never have done in his whole life. He had actually to publicly show his contrition, his repentance, to admit publicly, in other words, that he had been wrong. He had to walk between two aisles of people, walk towards what? His beloved baptistry of San Giovanni, his beloved baptismal font, the building that already existed and that was completed, and in which Dante was baptized in 1266. He had to walk to that font, and wearing a mitre, a cappello on his head, that was really a caricature, the sort of thing that a clown, a buffoon would wear. And he had to put up with the ridicule and the opprobrium of the populace. And Dante, that is something that Dante would never do. And we are fortunate that we have a letter that he wrote to the friend who suggested him that he could return to Florence in 1315 if he was prepared to accept the conditions that the Comune placed upon his return. And there is a text there from the Epistola, the number 3, that it's again the prose, and only have the English in this case because the original is in Latin. All the letters that Dante wrote are in Latin. And here it is. This is, in fact, a translation by Lee Hunt that you find in the Notes to Longfellow's Paradiso. You find this. So the letter begins by thanking his friend for the mediation, the suggestion, the attempt that he's making to get Dante back into Florence. But then this is how he actually replies. Is this then the gracious invitation by which Dante Alighieri is revoked to his country, to his home, after suffering in exile almost 15 years? Is it thus they would recompense innocence, which all the world knows, and the labor and fatigue of unremitting study? Far be from the man who is familiar with philosophy the senseless baseness of a heart of earth that could act as a little sciolist and imitate the infamy of some others by offering himself up, as it were, in chains, far from a man who cries aloud for justice, is compromised by his money with his persecutors. No, my father, my friend, this is not the way that shall lead me back to my country. I will return with hasty steps if you or any other can open to me a way that shall not derogate from the fame and honor of Dante. But if by no such way Florence can be entered, then Florence I shall never enter. Then Florence I shall never enter. And he never entered Florence. One can say that instead of going back to Florence, what did Dante do? Dante wrote this magnificent, unique poem. This miracle of language, miracle of ideas, of imagination, that is the Commedia, the 100 cantos. And in many ways, one can say that that writing is a substitute for Florence. It's both a way of condemning Florence, and there are many, many points in which Dante attacks Florence and the Florentines in the poem. And at the same time, it is also a way of explaining, of describing, of articulating in the most encyclopedic and complete way his total love and devotion for the city, the ideal of the city. There is a moment, in fact, in the Paradiso, in Canto 15, 16, and 17 Paradiso, when Dante meets his great-great-grandfather Cacciaguida. And Cacciaguida, whom Dante obviously never met, probably. We know that he existed, but whether Dante knew more about him than we do is doubtful, I think. It's really Dante's own invention. It is, in fact, Dante himself who speaks through Cacciaguida. Well, Cacciaguida gives us a description of the beauty of Florence, tranquil, serene, peaceful, about 150 years before 1300. That is the pre-commercial, the pre-mercantile, the pre-financial Florence is described by Dante as a dream that must be recaptured, that must be recreated. Dante has this idea of writing a poem that will persuade everyone, both church and state, both friends and foes, to return to what Florence was 150 years before, to turn the wheel of time, to go back. This is Dante's dream. And it is obviously totally impossible dream. Because Dante realizes, understands the contradictions in which the present society lives with all its conflicts. But his way out of the present contradiction is what? Is the realization of this extraordinary dream of peace that probably never existed in reality, because that dream is Dante's own fabrication. It is not anything that is historically true. But there is one thing that we know, that is that the foundations of that successful Florence of the year 1300, those foundations were laid perhaps exactly at the time of Cacciaguida, the time when Cacciaguida, or Dante, describes Florence as being so peaceful, so static. In fact, far from it, Florence was moving on and was becoming one of the powerhouses of European
finance. In 1252, Florence coined il maledetto fiore, the accursed florin. The money with the effigy of St. John the Baptist on one side, and on the other, the Florentine lily, the fiorino, that became, in fact, the most coveted, the most sought after currency in Europe of the 14th century. The most powerful currency, the dollar, if you want, of the 14th century. And Dante hated it so much that he called it il maledetto fiore che desviate le pecore e gli agni. So the accursed flower, the accursed florin that has led astray the sheep and the lambs, that is the grown-ups and the children, that has therefore destroyed the actual texture of society. I must come to an end. One thing that Cacciaguida does is to, in addition to give Dante an idea of what Florence was like 150 years earlier, it also gives Dante an idea of what his future is going to be like. That is Dante's future. I should mention here the fact that the Divine Comedy, the action of the Divine Comedy, the journey that Dante accomplishes in, and that he describes in the Divine Comedy, is set in the Easter week of the year 1300. So we are given some ideas or facts that happened after 1300, but only as prophecies. Because Dante is writing now, but it's in 1320, so he knows what happened between 1320 and 1300. But those facts are given as prophecies. And Cacciaguida prophesies to Dante what? He prophesies Dante's own exile. And this is the last text that I want to read. And it is a very famous text. Tu lascerai ogni cosa diletta più caramente. This is what is up, yes, up. I think, yeah, there it is. Down. The next text. Very good. So that's it. Here we are. Canto 17, line 55 to 60. These are the two terzine that we were taught at school, even in primary school, in the scuola elementare. We learned by heart this terzine and thought of il padre Dante being exiled from his home, which is here described as the matrigna, as the matrigna, la noverca. This is what Cacciaguida says to his great-grandson, Dante Alighieri. Tu lascerai ogni cosa diletta più caramente. E questo è quello strale che l'arco dell'esilio pria saetta. Tu proverai sì come sa di sale lo pane altrui, e come duro calle lo scendere e il salir per l'altrui scale. This is Dante's destiny. When Dante wrote this, probably around 1318, he knew very well how salty was the bread that he earned by going up and down other people's stairs, by begging people to keep him. People like Guido Novello, people like Can Grande della Scala in Verona, and other signori and signorotti that he had the good luck of finding for himself and for his children. This is Allen Vanderbaum's translation. You shall leave everything you love most dearly. This is the arrow that the bow of exile shoots first. You are to know the bitter taste of others' bread, how salt it is, and know how hard a path it is for one who goes descending and ascending others' stairs. So, but that exile, out of that exile came this extraordinary poem that is now known all over the world, translated in most languages of the world, talked about, imitated, caricatured, videotaped, all of in so many languages, in so many fashions, that Dante himself would be surprised at seeing how his future prospered, despite the fact that he had been locked out of his home of Florence. In the following 8 cantos, from Canto 26 to Canto 33, Dante tells how he reaches heaven. He's already in heaven, but how he reaches the Empyrean, which is the place, if we can call it with that particular word, outside of space and outside time, where all the blessed are gathered together around the glory of God. And Dante, as a living person, is given, by himself as a poet, is given this extraordinary privilege of seeing God face to face for a split second. So Dante, as a living person, goes from the bottom, from the center of earth, to the outer reaches of the universe. There he gets, in a way, home, to this real home, to his real Jerusalem, from the exile of this earth. So he manages to reach the ultimate fulfillment in his poem. But he never made it back to his earthly home, never made it back to his Florence, as I mentioned earlier. In fact, he died only 18 months later, in September 1321. He died of malaria, which he had contracted on his way back from Venice, where he had been negotiating on behalf of Guido Novello da Polente for a local war. He came back and died, probably surrounded by his children, by Pietro, by Jacopo, probably by his daughter Antonia, probably even by his wife, Gemma Donati. Thank you. This is it. It's now, oh yes, 5.
Benissimo, benissimo, professore, grazie molte, many thanks. We have a couple of questions, if you still have 5-10 minutes.
I'm very happy about it.
Yes, okay, so the first one is this. The physical image of Florence for Dante probably was of course, it was completely different from it is today. So while Santa Maria Novella was there, the Duomo, Palazzo Vecchio, and some others were just starting to be built, probably a short time before he was exiled. What did the skyline of Florence look like for Dante? What do you think? Can you give us a very short imaginary description?
Well, the original city in which he lived before the great expansion that occurred was very small. In the year 1200, the historians think that there were about 20,000 people living in Florence. In 1300, there were 5 times as many. It was up to 100,000 people were living there. So the expansion had been enormous in 100 years. At the time when, the cities were not that big. Florence was one of the major metropolis in the world, as it was known then. And the expansion, the architectural expansion, went along with that kind of financial expansion of the city. And there was a lot of public and a lot of private building that was going on. So it was a major building site. And Dante hated it. He hated to see all this restlessness. Because he thought it was, and human energies were directed to the wrong end in that way. And the city then was really rather very modest, in the 1260s when Dante was born. So it was really small and modest, and the Palazzo Vecchio existed in an earlier shape, but it was built up and became Palazzo dei Priori, and then eventually became under the Medici what it is now.
Signoria. Della
Signoria. Yeah, exactly. Signoria is something that happened much later. Dante belongs to the Comune, which is a different sort of setup. It's a development that occurs, and it is economical and social as well as cultural development that happens. So the look of Florence is of a much smaller city with very tiny little streets, and a typical medieval city at that time. But Dante was perfectly satisfied with that, and he certainly wasn't in favor of building anything new. The only thing that was already there was the baptistry of Saint John, San Giovanni, Battistello, il mio bel San Giovanni, where Dante was baptized in 1266, a year after he was born. We know that for certain. And Dante was longing to go back there and be given a big welcome back by his city, and something that he obviously never got.
And in fact, with this, it goes the next question, which is, do you think Dante would have gone, and this is by Megan Law, is asking, do you think Dante would have gone back to Florence if given a more generous invitation, or had he perhaps embraced the identity of an exile? Would you think that, would he think Florence was worth going back to?
I think Dante would have gone back, definitely. Dante never took the identity of an exile. I think that notion of the exile is something that develops much later. It's they never spoke of exile. They spoke of banishment. They spoke about being fuoriusciti, you see, rather than being exiled. It's not a state of being exile. It's supposed to be a temporary state of affairs, and Dante didn't find a second home. This is the great difference, you see. Dante, it's not that he went to Verona or he went to Ravenna and then he built a new life for himself there. No. He spent the first
we know for a fact that he spent the first 3 or 4 years in Tuscany and then kept returning to Tuscany.
Yes.
And then between Tuscany and also these main places of shelter where he found shelter were Verona and then later Ravenna, where he died. But you never have the impression that Dante has found a new home.
Mm. Yeah, and it gives this impression from
Right.
the pieces you read for us.
Right. His home is with Florence, and that is not, for him, he's still un vagabondo, he's still in a nomadic state. He's moving, and I should go I would have to go into greater details, but the politics of the time were extremely intricate. And he was involved in those politics, and the politics that had to do with the church, with the empire, with the allies of the empire. And so it was very delicate, and it was dangerous as well as uncomfortable.
Right. We can only imagine, especially now in this time where we cannot go to our own cities if you are away, right? I mean,
Yeah.
To me, this is, it's very close to my heart because I'm from
That's
Florence.
Right.
And I don't know whether I can go back in the summer or not. So, I mean, this is nothing compared to the pain of Dante, of course, but I kind of feel it, yes. There are another couple of questions and you can reply very quickly. Do you know where Gemma Donati is buried? And this is asked by Margaret Cianfarini. Gemma Donati, do we know anything about her?
My answer is no, I don't know, but it was a very good question. I've got to find out about it.
Yeah, if you want, maybe next year, if we can connect again, that'd be great.
I don't think that we have a documents about that. There is a collection of documents that is absolutely invaluable, collected by a scholar of the 19th century called Renato Piattoli, and it has been republished very recently, but I don't think there is anything about that, but I could be wrong. But we know that she stayed in Florence because she grew up, the children there, the children grew up there while Dante was away. And they had to join him, when they were at least 14 years after the, but we don't know where she died, and so she might be in Florence.
And Margaret is also asking, do we know if Boccaccio, in writing his Trattatello in Laude di Dante, spoke with Dante's sons? Do we know anything about this Boccaccio, maybe?
We know Boccaccio. The problem is Boccaccio that we are never quite sure whether Boccaccio is making up things or not. Even if Boccaccio said that he had talked with Pietro in Ravenna, and which is possible because Boccaccio was younger than Dante's children. Boccaccio was born in 1313, so he might have been as young as 20. He might have been as much as 20 years younger than, say, than Pietro and Jacopo. But I'm sure that he might have met him. No, I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly that. Yes, he did. But if he says that he met him in the Trattatello, and there are scholars will say, well, he might well say that, but have we got any independent source that is going to tell us that it's true? Boccaccio also tells a story that he doesn't believe in it itself, that Boccaccio tells the story that Dante had started writing the Divine Comedy before 1300. So that is a completely different story. So Boccaccio has many stories of this kind.
Yeah. And now we have Joanne Polci, who is writing, my husband's family is related to John Ciardi in the Boston area. Do you find these translations of Dante's works useful?
I I haven't used it very much. I think it is a very good translation. Whenever I used it, I found it very satisfying. But I haven't used it much, I must say.
Do you have a translator that you use the most?
Well, I used, when in my last classes, I used the Hollander translation that came out recently. Or I used, earlier on, I used the Mandelbaum. I also like a lot the Darling Martinez. These are translations that are good also because they are very, very fully annotated. And they have the Italian on one side and the English on this side. And it's important to have annotation so that people know, people, if they want to find out, they want to answer, they can look at the notes and find the answer to their questions.
Okay.
But I know that John Chardy is one of the great translators, I can't say that I have a special experience of this translation.
Now I have the last questions and then one from me. The last question is from our audience, and we had many people, so thanks again. Is from Sara Lemelin, and this is a little bit of a gossip, un po' di pettegolezzi danteschi. Do we know anything about how Gemma Donati felt about the role of Beatrice in Dante's writing?
No, we don't.
No, it's an interesting question. I never thought about
no,
that.
It's an extremely interesting question, but it's based on our perception of this triangle, and we have no idea as to, or rather, the idea that we have about relationships in the 13th, 14th century are that you did not speak in terms of adultery if your husband was a poet and was talking about another woman.
Exactly. This is fun. My quick question. I never understood really well why Florence has the giglio as a symbol. I thought it was from France, but I'm not really sure. Now you mentioned it when you talked about the cursed flooring, right? The maledetto fiore. And you said that on one side there was the giglio, the lily. So can you tell us very quickly where that come from? Of course, that Firenze, Fiorenza means flower.
Yeah. The fiore definitely comes from the name of the city. The fleur de lis, that is also the symbol of France, is a coincidence. It's not that. It is true that as a Guelph city, Florence was often allied with France and the Pope. Something that Dante did not like, because Dante alliances were with the emperor, and certainly not with France. So Dante was very much anti-French and in favor of the empire, and wrote to Florentine, to Florence. He wrote a very, very inflaming letters, begging the city to welcome the emperor into its walls. When the emperor came down in 1311, 1312. But the connection with Florence is between Florence and France does exist, and there are some scholars who think that actually Dante was in Paris for a period during the year of his exile. He spent some time in Paris, but there is no documents about it at all. So.
Right. So it can be a little bit of both, maybe a little bit of the Firenze, the name, and the alliance with France that lasted centuries, right?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so with this we will conclude, but I want to tell you that we have a lot of compliments on the chat. Giovanni Saraceni, whom you might remember,
Yes.
you know, he's saying grazie professore, magnifica lezione, ci ha riportati indietro ai tempi della scuola, grazie alla Dante Alighieri di Cambridge che ha reso possibile questo prestigioso evento, and so many other compliments. Grazie mille professore, Sara Netsky, and so on. So thanks again. We are hoping, as the Dante Alighieri of Massachusetts, we are hoping that maybe in 2021 we can celebrate the 700th anniversary of Dante's death, and maybe, perhaps, possibly, we wish that you will be present with us either in Cambridge or online, because this is a pretty good way.
If you put it that way, then we are all sort of well enough. I'm sure it is possible that we can do it. I may be in Cambridge, but or here, but in a way or another, we find a way.
Yes.
I enjoyed very much talking, even if it is. I prefer to talk with people rather than talking to my computer. But it was a pleasure.
Yes, and you had really many attendees. So thanks again, Professor Pertile. I hope you had a great day.
Grazie Chiara, molto gentile. Grazie.
Hopefully we can talk more next year.
Molto bene, grazie del tuo aiuto e buona fortuna con tutti, tanti auguri.
Grazie anche a lei. Arrivederci a tutti. Grazie a tutti e alla prossima. Ciao.
Bene. Ciao.